Influence is a common theme in understanding leadership, so related research and theory make an important contribution to understanding leadership. The information in this module will contribute to the goal of being able to apply research from psychology to explain leadership processes, including emergence and effectiveness. The overarching concept in this unit is social influence, or the interpersonal processes that change a person's thoughts, feelings, or behavior. When that influence takes place within a group in a way that makes the individual more like other group members, it's called conformity. When the influence is in response to a person in a position of authority, it's called obedience. Forsyth talks about the sources of influence in the context of conformity and associates obedience with power. But when we think about leadership, I think it's helpful to consider the sources of influence as they relate to both conformity and obedience. There are 4 broad sources of influence with varying degrees of applicability for understanding leadership. Implicit influence is a more general process, like when we face the front of an elevator because everyone else in the elevator is facing that way. In those situations, group members and their norms are less relevant than broader social customs or other situational influences, so this may be the least relevant for leadership. 2 of the sources of influence, informational and normative, both relate to fitting in. The labels used for those types of influence are a bit confusing. They aren't as intuitive as they can be, for me at least, but when I think about their meaning, they make a little more sense. In informational influence, the person being influenced is considering other people as sources of information about a more general social context. In normative influence, the person is trying to fit in with a specific group by going along with the expectations for that group, or what's normal for that group. The reason thinking about that helps me think about and make sense of the labels is because the idea of information is more general than the idea of norms. That difference might also relate to the point about the strength of the norms and focus theory. As we think about leadership, we might ponder whether we think that normative influence or interpersonal influence is more relevant. For now, it's interesting to note that interpersonal influence is the only one of the 4 sources that involves deliberate efforts by the person trying to influence another person. That said, I mentioned that social influence can take 2 forms, conformity and obedience. Conformity is the tendency of people to act and think like the people around them. It probably isn't hard to think of examples of conformity in popular culture, like trends in clothing, music, food, and entertainment. Conformity has been observed in a wide range of contexts, though. The ASH studies are particularly iconic in helping us understand the extent of conformity and the factors that influence it. The participants did not have a strong connection to the groups. In other words, we might not think they really had a reason to care what the others thought, but many of them still gave an obviously wrong answer rather than contradict the group. While we tend to emphasize that aspect of conformity in the studies, it's also important to note when the individuals that disagreed with the majority did so. That has a number of implications for leadership as well. The other broad category of social influence is obedience, which is often associated with sources of power, as demonstrated by the title of the related chapter in the Forsyth book. Obedience involves complying with the directions of someone perceived to be in a position of authority. I'm intentionally making the definition slightly more complicated than it is in some other sources by adding the word perceived. The Milgram studies provided a lot to think about, and not just because of the number of people who obeyed. As we think about leadership, it's especially relevant to think about what influences perceptions of authority and, therefore, leads to levels of obedience. The Zimbardo prison experiment also helps to think about the way the role influences the degree to which we expect obedience, which is interesting to think about, again, in the context of leadership. One thing you might have already thought about is that we use the term leader or leadership when we're talking about people in a wide range of roles. That can lead to differences in perspective, though, about how a leader can influence others. Yep, back to the elephant again. Forsyth helps us understand the concepts known as power, compliance, and status, all of which are related to influence and could, therefore, be related to leadership. In applying them to leadership, though, I encourage you to think about the setting in which you're thinking about leadership. I'll provide a few examples of what I mean by that in the next slides. As I mentioned, obedience is associated with power. defined as the capacity to influence others, even when they resist influence. I can see the potential for the need to influence a resistant follower in many settings. That said, then, it takes us to the source of the power. On one hand, it's easy to see some of these sources as only applying in the workplace or other settings where someone has a title like a manager or maybe a teacher. With further reflection, though, they can all apply in a wide range of settings. For example, in the next unit, we'll learn about the value of belonging. And that suggests that including someone or giving them praise could be a reward that does not require money or other things. Similarly, the silent treatment can be a strong punishment. The use of power tactics may be what varies then in different leadership settings. Many of the tactics mentioned in Table 8.2 of the Group Dynamic book don't fit with what I think of when I think of leadership. Along with that, I thought Forsyth made a powerful point related to leadership in writing, when people need to poke, prod, or prompt others into action, their choice of power tactic is limited only by their ingenuity, self-regulation, and willingness to ignore social controls. Similarly, we might question whether the use of compliance tactics fits with leadership. The idea of getting someone to accept something or do something that doesn't fit with their beliefs and or their interests seems not leader-like to me, especially when we get to the idea of them being subtle and not easy to detect. Our definition of leadership, though, is influencing members of a group to achieve a common goal. Research and theory suggest the way individual exercises power has a number of implications beyond that initial influence, too, adding to the implications for leadership. The group dynamics texts provide information about implications in two areas: social status and the effects of power. Thinking about our knowledge about the process of influence relates to one of the main themes and the many definitions of leadership. Researchers in psychology have done a number of studies and provide numerous related theories on the concepts related to influence, but we're going to focus on four main topics: general understanding of influence, process of conformity, our knowledge of obedience, and the use of power.